I'd like to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the latest DNR webinar on stormwater discharge requirements for printers. Today's program is brought to you by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Green Tier Program, SGP, the FTA, Great Lakes Graphics Association, Printing United, and TLMI. Your moderator is myself, Joe Lyman. I'm president of the Great Lakes Graphics Association. We represent printers, finishers, binders, converters, tag and label manufacturers, and packagers throughout the three-state region, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin. A little bit about the webcast logistics. All attendees are muted. If you have a question or comment, you can always use the chat box in the lower center of the screen. Questions can always be answered at the end of the program. And this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available to you in the next few days, along with some information about other programs such as the Green Tier and SGP program. A little bit about today's agenda. We'll welcome and have introductions. We'll talk about Wisconsin's regulatory authority and framework for permitting. We'll provide an overview of the no exposure certification. We'll provide an overview of the Tier 2 Wisconsin Pollution Discharge Elimination System, WPDES, general permit, and also an introduction of the e-permitting system. Today, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. First, we have Jamie Lambert. She is a wastewater specialist senior with the Department of Natural Resources, working under the Division of External Services. Jamie graduated from the University of Wisconsin Parkside in 2005 with a BS in Geosciences and Geographical Information Systems certification. She started work with the department in April of 2006. Jamie will be presenting information today on the Tier 2 Wisconsin Pollution Discharge Elimination System general permit and an overview of no exposure certification. We also have Melissa Yarrington. She is a storm water program coordinator with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and the External Services Division. Melissa had previously administered the construction, industrial, and municipal sectors in the stormwater program for the past 7 years prior to her current role. Melissa received a Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin Stevens Point in watershed management with an emphasis in water chemistry. Previous work experience includes both water and environmental testing and analyses, as well as applied research. Melissa will be presenting today on Wisconsin's regulatory framework for permitting, and we'll finish the presentation with an overview of e-permitting system. Welcome, Jamie and Melissa.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. So welcome, and thank you, Joe, for moderating this, and thank you for inviting both Jamie and I to come talk with you today. As Joe had said, I'm going to start out with an overview of the industrial stormwater program. But I think it's important to give you some background. So the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, regulates point source discharges from certain categories of discharges under Section 402 of the Clean Water Act. The program these discharges are regulated under is called the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES program. Wisconsin received its NPDES delegation from the EPA to administer the provisions of the Clean Water Act in the state of Wisconsin. Here in Wisconsin, we've developed a companion program to the NPDES program, which we call the Wisconsin Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or the WPDES program. In Wisconsin, we also regulate point source discharges from municipal, construction, and industrial facilities through the issuance of WPDES permits. The criteria for facilities requiring coverage is outlined in Chapter 216 Wisconsin Administrative Code. Will you go to the next slide, please, Joe? So what do we regulate? So in Wisconsin, we regulate the point source discharge to waters of the state that have exposure of pollutants or potential exposure of pollutants that would discharge to either surface water or groundwater. This varies slightly from discharges that are regulated under the Clean Water Act because Wisconsin regulates discharges to groundwater in addition to surface water, which is considered a waters of the state, where the Clean Water Act applies to discharges that only discharge to waters of the United States. Next slide, please. So to summarize, Wisconsin does have similar requirements to Section 402 of the Federal Clean Water Act, with the exception that discharges to groundwater via infiltration are also regulated. Wisconsin was granted its authority by the legislature to promulgate rules regulating these discharges requiring coverage under 28333 Wisconsin statutes. The stormwater program administers these rules and defines the categories requiring permit coverage under subchapter 2 of NR 216, Wisconsin Administrative Code. Subchapter 2 of NR 216 defines that the categories of discharges that require stormwater permits, and also outlines how those facilities which may be exempt from permitting are able to obtain no exposure certification. So the bottom line is, if you are identified in NR 216 as being a facility that's required to have a permit, then you are required to apply for a Tier 2 permit. The other option is if you can meet the eligibility criteria of no exposure certification, then you are required to have an exemption from permitting. Next slide, please. Before we dive in any further, I just want to give you a broad overview about how our program is broken up throughout the state. So we are broken up by the various functions that we serve, similar to the other programs throughout the state of Wisconsin. Central office staff are responsible for program coordination, guidance, outreach, rule promulgation, and reissuance of the general permits. Regional staff are responsible for permitting facilities under the general permits and implementing the program within their areas of coverage. Regional staff conduct inspections and assess compliance of the facilities to determine if they're meeting the conditions of the permit or exclusions from permitting. Where necessary, they also may take enforcement. The contact link sheet shown here in the PowerPoint is live. It's my understanding that this PowerPoint will be provided to you. So if you need to reach out to regional staff or central office, you can select the county contacts based on where your facility would be located. Will you do the next slide, please? Now that you understand the various functions that we serve, I want to talk a little bit more about how we go about permitting or the exclusion from permitting. As I had mentioned, stormwater discharges that require coverage, are found in subchapter 2 of NR 216. NR 216 contains a list of what we call standard industrial classification codes, or SIC codes. These codes are the same codes used by EPA to define the categories of discharges that require permit coverage. Printers and allied products are covered under Major Standard Industrial Classification Code 27. We in Wisconsin have classified these facilities as light manufacturing, which are regulated under the Tier 2 permit. If a facility falls within a SIC code, which requires regulation, but can demonstrate they do not have any exposure of pollutants, they would be eligible for an exclusion from permitting under that, from permitting under that exclusion. Next slide, please. I apologize for the small numbers on this graph, but I think I'll just kind of walk through this with you. So in Wisconsin, the total number of facilities that fall into major SIC group classification for printers is 163. Of those facilities, roughly 90% have demonstrated that they are eligible for no exposure certification. The other 10% were not able to demonstrate that they do not have an exposure of pollutants as part of their operations. Here I've highlighted the three major categories of SIC codes. SIC code 2752, which represents 41% of our permittees or no exposure certification facilities, are classified into the commercial printing lithographic series. 2759, which is Commercial printing, which is not elsewhere classified, is 26% of our facilities. And 12% of our facilities are newspapers involved in printing or printing and publishing of newspapers. Now that you have an understanding of the discharges that require coverage in the state, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Jamie to go into the specifics on the permit or exclusion from permitting.
Next slide. Good afternoon, and thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to attend this presentation. It's an honor to be here. Next slide. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Next. Okay, thank you. I'm putting this down again. SIC codes, as Melissa mentioned, the standard industrial classification codes are one thing we look at when assessing if a business requires a permit or NEC. Here's a list of the SIC codes associated with the printing industry. I've left off SIC code 7334, which is photocopying and duplicating services. Though listed within the printer's SIC codes, it is not one we regulate. Next slide. Here's the list of the Tier 2 permit requirements I'll be touching on today. Chemical monitoring is not required unless we request it. This might happen due to a release of a reportable quantity of a hazardous substance at the facility. The Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, or the SWIP, and I tell you, government agencies love their acronyms. I can't begin to tell you how lost I was when I first started at the DNR. I had no idea what a BMP or an ASCII was, and it was a little daunting at first, as in the first couple of years. The quarterly and annual inspections and reporting, for which we have forms on our e-permitting website, and the annual fee, which is $130 a year for the Tier 2 permit. This will be billed annually. You do not need to submit it with your notice of intent. Also, once you've been permitted, there is no need to resubmit when the new permit rolls out every 4 years. Your permit will automatically be reissued. The only time you'll need to do anything is if your business is closing, moving, or there's been a change in ownership and you want to transfer permit coverage. Next. The SWIP is intended to be a living document, modified and updated as necessary. Also, when submitting your SWIP, please submit a signed and dated copy. The SWIP has been developed as required under Part 3 of Wisconsin's Pollutant Discharge Elimination System General Permit for stormwater discharges and in accordance with good engineering practices. A SWIP describes your facility and its operations. It identifies potential sources of stormwater pollution at the facility, recommends appropriate best management practices, or BMPs, or pollution control measures to reduce the discharge of pollutants in stormwater runoff, and provides for periodic review and updating. The site drainage map should include all stormwater drains and outfalls, outside storage areas, and stormwater runoff flow direction arrows. Next. Here on the right side, you'll see the table of contents for the Wisconsin sample SWIP. You're not required to use this template. There are others out there on the World Wide Web that you can reference. EPA also has a great document on developing your SWIP that you may want to look at. I've included the links for your convenience. Next. The next 3 slides will go over some of the areas at your facility that should be incorporated into your SWIP. What I call the areas of concern. These areas are considered high on the list as potential sources of stormwater contamination. You have your immediate access roads. Here you can track out material to roadway storm drains. You also have railway spurs, owned or operated by the permittee, where there can be the loss of material when loading or unloading, or leaking railroad cars are a concern. Next. Rooftops contaminated by industrial activity, exhaust vents, or a pollution control device. Is there an air permit associated with the facility? I only bring this up as it may play a part should you be looking to be approved for no exposure certification. If the rest of the outdoor areas of concern comply with the NEC, but there is considerable staining on the roof, then I look to see if you have an air permit. If so, then you're probably going to be approved. If not, then you may be denied the exemption depending on what's causing the staining. Next. Next areas of concern are the loading and unloading docks. They should be free of petroleum residuals, past and present. So your company may have just moved into the building, but the docks have significant residual staining. There's no saying, but we didn't do it. It was there when we moved in. It still counts. I've had businesses that asphalt over the residuals, thus containing the contamination in order to qualify for NEC, and that's perfectly okay. Material vehicle storage areas. For material storage areas, we look at what type of materials there are. Do they have the potential to pollute stormwater runoff? Clean pallets are fine. Pallets that have been treated need to be under cover or indoors. Vehicle or equipment storage areas, we look for petroleum residuals or rusting equipment. For lugger boxes and trash receptacles, they need to have permanent hard covers, no tarps unless the box is there for construction or remodeling purposes on a temporary basis. In this case, you can use a tarp to cover it when not in use. The containers should also be in good condition with no rusting or holes. Next. For your quarterlies, you will be doing visual inspections of stormwater discharge quality at each stormwater outfall. This should be done within the first 30 minutes of discharge or as soon thereafter, but not exceeding 60 minutes. By that time, you've missed what we call the first flush, which would most represent what's coming off your property. Observations of color, odor, turbidity, floating solids, foam, oil sheen, or other observations and obvious indicators of stormwater pollution should be recorded. Include the inspection date, name of the individual or individuals doing the inspection, visual quality of the stormwater discharge, and probable sources of any observed stormwater contamination. The annual Facility Site Compliance Inspection, or ASCII report. This will include the inspection date, inspection personnel, scope of the inspection, major observations, and revisions if needed in the SWIP. It also includes a brief summary of your quarterly reports. I'm not sure how we ended up using an acronym for the annual report and then for the quarterly. Shouldn't there be a QC? Next. The industrial permit exemption or no exposure certification. In order to qualify for NEC, discharges must be composed entirely of stormwater. There should be no exposure of industrial materials and activities to stormwater that have the potential to pollute the stormwater runoff. All industrial materials and activities should be protected by a storm-resistant shelter. Next. Applying for no exposure certification. Make sure outdoor materials and activities are protected from exposure to stormwater. Use the online e-permitting system, NOI, and check that you're applying for NEC and make sure to include photos of the areas of concern. Resubmit your request every 5 years and allow DNR inspections to determine compliance. Next. Reiterating some of the areas of concern, open lugger boxes, trash dumpsters, compactors, as they tend to leak hydraulic fluid and debris, patrol.
Hello,
Did we lose Jamie?
Jamie? We have lost Jamie.
All right. Well, I will pick it up where she left off. So some of the areas, just to continue, some of the areas of concern that we look at with the no exposure certification are petroleum residuals and loading docks or vehicle storage areas. So petroleum residuals would be a source area exposure, which would preclude a facility from being eligible for no exposure certification. These are of particular concern when they're located directly adjacent to storm drain inlets. On a similar token, what Jamie was talking about earlier was roof vents. So as she had mentioned, residual staining on roofs is only a concern if the facility does not have a current air permit. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So now that we've given you a brief overview of the Tier 1 and no exposure certification process and what it is that we look for, I'm going to talk to you about our e-permitting site. So as I had mentioned earlier, any facility that has a standard industrial classification code of the major group 27, which is applicable to printers, either needs to apply for a Tier 2 permit or a no exposure certification. So permit applications and no exposure certifications and no exposure certification renewals are completed online using our e-permitting system. The link shown here is where you can access the e-permitting system. Next slide, please. To begin an application, you must first apply for a Wisconsin Access Management System. We at the DNR do not administer the Wisconsin Access Management System IDs or WAMS IDs. That's administered through DOA. Once you've obtained a WAMS ID, by clicking on the register button on the water permit application page, you can begin or edit a new application. Go ahead and next slide. To begin a new application, you will simply click on the Begin button shown and highlighted on the screen here. Next slide. This is going to log you into the main Wisconsin DNR water permit site. Following the instructions on the screen is going to allow you to apply for various permits. You can select a category from the left side menu as highlighted here, in which case you would click on stormwater. Next slide. Then you will see an available list of options for you. As I explained earlier, the stormwater industrial permit covers subchapter 2 of NR 216, covers all of our industrial stormwater permits that are required to obtain permit coverage under NR 216 as point source discharges to waters of the state. The no exposure certification is also found under subchapter 2 of NR 216. So when applying for that application, you will find it under the stormwater industrial permit tab. Next page. When you click on the industrial stormwater general permit, this is the very first screen that you're going to see. I know it looks big and scary. It is going to require you to do a little bit of reading, but I'll talk through some of this with you here right now. So the very first thing that we're going to be asking you is if this is a newly built facility or a facility requesting WIPD's permit coverage for the first time. The second question is a similar. The second question, Gary, we will hop back to your question in a little bit. The second question is, does this facility already have a Wisconsin pollution discharge elimination permit or a no exposure certification? What we're trying to get at with these two questions that are similar but worded slightly different is whether or not the facility has an existing permit coverage. The next information that's requested of you is the date that industrial operations will or have begun. For a renewal no exposure certification, you're going to be entering the date that your existing no exposure certification expires. No exposure certifications are good for a period of 5 years, at which time you must reapply. You'll also have to enter in your Wisconsin Pollution Discharge Elimination System permittee name. In some circumstances, the facility and site name is similar, but in other circumstances, companies find that it's necessary to distinguish between facilities with the same parent company name but operate in different locations and use this facility and site name to distinguish between those locations. Click on the next slide, please. In this example, I'm just going to run through one that I mocked up here for you. I'm not applying for a no exposure certification. This is my first time applying for a WIPD's permit, and I don't currently have a no exposure certification record with the department. In this example, I know that my industrial operations are going to begin today. and I see that I backdated that a month. My WIPD's parent company name is Topography Inc., and my facility site name is Melissa's Printing Press. At this point in time, you're going to press to refresh the missing fields. Next slide, please. At which point you're going to gain access to the site tabs that are highlighted above. Most users find it best to navigate through these site tabs by continuing to the next tab button. Continuing to the next tab will allow you to move through the application while ensuring there's no missing information. For the purposes of this demonstration today, however, I'm going to have you go to the next slide, and where we're going to talk a little bit about the application tab. So within the application tab, it's really common that a facility may not know its exact standard industrial classification code. We've included a link within our application that goes to the OSHA SIC code lookup table. Next slide, please. In this example, I entered the search or keyword of printing. Once you do that, it will give you a list of SIC codes that may be applicable to your facility. In this example, you have Major Group 27, the printing, publishing, and allied industries. Next slide, please. Once I've determined my applicable SIC code, I'm going to enter that principal activity and SIC code description into the drop-down menu shown below bullet point 1 in the applicability section. In 2, I'm going to provide a brief description of the industrial activity and land use that I'm undertaking at the site. If you exceed 250 characters, you can attach supplemental information on the attachments page. Next slide, please. Oh, I accidentally have a duplicate slide in here, so would you go to the next slide, please? So also within the applications tab, we're going to ask you a series of questions about operations at the facility. So one of the major things that Jamie was hitting on before is whether the facility has vehicle maintenance shops, equipment cleaning operations, vehicle washing, or any other type of fluids that may be exposed at the facility. You're going to select yes or no after doing a visual assessment. The second question is just trying to help us winnow out whether or not that this is a non-metallic mining facility, which has a site-specific permit through the state. In the stormwater discharge information, we ask how many outfalls the facility has. This is a really common question, is what does an outfall mean? Outfalls are locations where flow discharges to surface water, groundwater, wetlands, or storm sewers. Include any outfalls that are recognized as permitted under another Wisconsin pollution discharge elimination system. That might be a non-contact cooling water permit or any other wastewater permit that you might have. Question 2 asks a little bit more about the stormwater discharge information and whether or not any stormwater runoff has been analyzed for the presence of pollutants. Since most of these facilities are tier 2 facilities, it's unlikely that they have been analyzed for the presence of pollutants unless the department has previously requested that you complete sampling. Question 3 is in relation to total maximum daily loads, which are applied to specific water bodies, and also 303D impaired water bodies. One of the things that we request from all of our applicants is whether or not the facility has any discharges of pollutants of concern to receiving water bodies. During the site map portion, which we're not going over today, we have the ability for a permittee to look up whether or not their facility discharges to a TMDL water body or to a 303D or impaired water body. Question 4 pertains to any leaks, spills, drips, or similar substances of stormwater contamination that may have occurred at the facility within the last 3 years. Lastly, we ask if there's any material handling equipment or activities, including raw materials, intermediate products, final products, waste materials, byproducts, or industrial machinery located in areas that are exposed to rainfall, stormwater, or snowmelt. Will you go to the next slide, please? This is where I wanted to bring up the overview of this is where I wanted to bring up the resources that have been prepared by the Small Business and Environmental Assistance Program. We call them the SBS program, but they have a whole chapter dedicated to stormwater. It includes a list for the typical sources of pollutants, some of them which Jamie had touched on today. Others are those less conventional pollutants that you would consider. In this example, I chose yes, that I do have material handling equipment or activities that are exposed to stormwater. When you do select yes, you're going to be asked to describe those. In this circumstance, I use the example that I transfer solvents from one container to another outside. I also have an open top dumpster. Next, please. The SBS materials and the link previously provided on the last slide includes this exposure checklist. I'm not going to go into great detail on this right now, but it's similar to a checklist that I'm going to highlight later on in the application. Next slide, please. Also in the application tab, we're going to be asking you about other discharge information. This question pertains to any discharges other than stormwater, which would be included in the stormwater outfall. I had given you some examples previously about non-contact cooling water or any other type of wastewater permit that you would have. If you select yes here, a drop-down menu is going to pop up, and we're going to ask you to describe those discharges to us. Question 2 pertains to the facility or project receiving coverage under any other WIPD's general or environmental permits for non-stormwater discharges, such as management of hazardous waste, emissions of air pollutants, or underground injection. If you select yes to this question, another drop-down menu is going to pop up, and we're going to ask you to describe the types of permits that you have received. In the example that Jamie had given before with respect to air pollutants, this would be, if your facility has an air permit, this would be a location where you tell us about that air permit, because it's going to help us make a determination on whether or not a no exposure certification or an exclusion from permitting via the no exposure certification is appropriate. You'll also see that the last question on this page is the no exposure certification exclusion information. Will you advance the next slide, please? So in this example, I'm selecting yes, that I am applying for a no exposure certification exclusion. The second question is, are any of the following materials or activities exposed to participation now or in the foreseeable future? This would include activities that aren't currently exposed, but may become exposed during the course of normal operations. If you answer yes to any of these questions, it will make the facility ineligible for the no exposures exclusion. In these examples, if you'll recall, I had previously filled out that I transfer solvents back and forth. The transfer of solvents in open containers would be something that would preclude me from being able to be eligible for no exposure certification. If you answer yes to these questions, please make note, because it will become important later on in the application. Will you hit next, please? On the attachments page, we have a place for you to attach what Jamie had talked about a little bit before, was the stormwater pollution prevention plan. If your facility answered no to the no exposure certification exclusion questions and truly does not have any pollutants exposed on site, then you're going to click and add a file for your stormwater pollution prevention plan that indicates that your facility has no sources of exposure that are exposed to stormwater. If you answered yes to any of those questions in the no exposure exclusion information, your stormwater pollution prevention plan should include those as potential source areas, include the best management practices that you're going to be implementing, and ultimately follow the stormwater pollution prevention planning guide that Jamie previously provided to you, as you will have to submit that as an attachment. Next slide, please. I know Jamie had touched on this before. Another requirement is the inclusion of site photos with your application. If you're applying for an industrial tier 2 application, site photos, well, and I guess this would also apply to no exposure certification, When we're asking for site photos, the site photos we're looking for is where you're actually conducting these activities and where there may be exposure of pollutants to stormwater runoff, snow melt, and the like. We do not need photos of sidewalks or the front of buildings. We're really just concerned about where that light manufacturing activity is taking place. And with that, will you advance to the next slide? I am happy to start taking some questions from folks.
Melissa, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, yay, I'm back on.
Excellent.
Don't know what
excellent.
happened. My phone just shut off.
That is okay. So Jamie, it looks like we have a question from Gary. Sounds like since you're calling in, you can't read it, but I'm happy to read it to you. Gary is asking if we can elaborate more on the petroleum staining from vehicles under the permit and the no exposure certification and what the requirements are associated with petroleum staining. Gary was under the impression that oil and grease from vehicles and parking lots was exempt from coverage.
That's a parking lot. That's not your loading and unloading docks. We do not cover parking lots. So, wherever your employees are parking their cars, we're not looking at that. But we do look at your loading and unloading docks, those areas, or your vehicle storage areas for petroleum residuals. Can you clean them up? You can always try. I've had some facilities that have had luck doing that. Most facilities they'll asphalt over it and they'll start out clean. But we do look at that.
Kind of along the same lines, Jamie, I know I'm creating back and forth conversation between yourself and myself. If a facility was not eligible for no exposure certification and submitted a stormwater pollution prevention plan and a tier 2 application and was granted coverage, are they still eligible to come back and request no exposure certification if they were able to eliminate those sources of pollution?
Most definitely. Most definitely. And that's what we strive for.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Jamie, a question came in. Are you able to comment on dumpsters and how they're addressed under the no exposure certification?
Yes. Dumpsters, they should either have like a permanent hard cover on them and be closed when not in use. Like I know you have them maybe during the day or something, as long as it's not raining out, that's fine. Close them at night. We look at if there's excessive rusting on them, then you're going to have that washing off on stormwater. If there's holes in them, you're going to have leaking. So we look for containers that are in good condition and that have got your hard permanent covers.
Thanks, Jamie.
Any other questions?
Well, I appreciate everybody's time today. Jamie and Melissa, fantastic presentation, really succinct. I think it answered a whole lot of questions for people. I do want to thank the individuals that participated today as well. If you have any questions, we will be sending out some information here in the near future. Oh, we have one more question. If somebody were to build a shelter over a source of contamination such as a hydraulic pump, how would it be constructed? How should it be constructed?
I would say you would want it protected from the elements. So possibly either a secondary containment around it and like an overhang over it
Okay.
I guess I'd have to see the situation to be able to answer it
Okay.
more completely.
We have another question. In light of the recent reissuance of the Tier 1 general permit, does the need to sample for the 2 years after coverage and submit AFSCI's reset for the existing facility covered by the permit prior to reissuance?
So I will take this one. So I guess I will just say that for the facilities that we currently have under permit coverage, as it relates to the printing industry, they are covered under the Tier 2 permit, not the Tier 1 permit that was recently reissued. But to clarify your question, for the Tier 1 industrial stormwater general permit, the need to sample for 2 years after coverage, if you've already completed sampling, is not a requirement to continue coverage under that permit.
As long as they've,
As long as they've met that previous sampling requirement. And just for the person asking the question as well, if for some reason the department has reason to believe that there's a significant source of stormwater pollution, or there's some other criteria, we may request a facility sample again.
yeah, so we'll look at those benchmarks and see if they've met them.
I hope that answers your question.
Excellent. Well, again, we will be sending out some information here in the near future. So if you have any questions, you can obviously respond to that email. With that, I appreciate everybody's time today and have a fantastic afternoon. Take care, everyone.